Good morning, seventh graders. Yesterday, we got left on a cliffhanger that Maddie was contemplating healing Kira's leg, and that could be a real change in her life, which might be kind of neat. So today is chapter 14. Tomorrow will be chapters 15, and that's as far as we're going to get in the book. So for those of you who are interested in the book, I will, of course, leave the PDF up. I do hope that you take the time to read those last 4 or 5 chapters and see how the story ends. I think you'll really like the twists at the end. I haven't read them, but I am, of course, going to read them. And I probably will record the YouTubes. So if you do want to check in, even after school is over in the next few days, you're welcome to listen to me read you the chapters. All right, chapter 14. To his amazement, Kira said no. Not no to leaving. He hadn't suggested that to her, not yet. But a definite, unarguable no to the idea of a straightened whole leg. "This is who I am, Maddie," she said. "It's who I've always been." She looked at him fondly, but her voice was firm. It was evening. The fire glowed in the fireplace, and she had lit the oil lamps. Maddie wished that the blind man were in the room with them, playing his instrument. The soft, intricate chords always brought a peace to their evenings together. He wanted Kira to hear the music, to feel the comfort it brought. He had not yet told her that she was to return with him. During their supper together, as Kira chattered about the changes in the old village, how much better things were now, he had only half listened. In his mind, he had been weighing what to tell her and when and how. There was so little time, and he needed, Maddie knew, to present it to her in a decisive, convincing way. But suddenly, he heard her make a casual comment about her handicap. She was describing a small tapestry she had embroidered as a wedding gift for her friend Thomas, the woodcarver, who had recently been married. "It was all finished and rolled up, and I decorated it with flowers," she said. "In the morning of the wedding I set out carrying it, but it had rained. The path was wet, and I slipped and dropped the tapestry into a mud puddle. Luckily it was still early, so I came back here and was able to clean it. No one ever knew. My leg and stick are a nuisance when it's wet outdoors," she said. "My stick has never learned to navigate mud." She reached over to the pot and began to pour more tea into the mugs. Surprising himself, he blurted it out. "I can fix your leg." The room fell silent except for the hiss and crackle of the fire. Kira stared at Maddie. "I can," he said after a moment. "I have a gift. Your father says that you do too. You'll understand." "I do," Kira agreed. "I always have, but my gift doesn't fix twisted things." "I know. Your father told me yours is different." Kira looked down at her hands, wrapped around her mug of tea. She opened her fingers, spread her hands upon the table, and turned them over. Maddie could see the slender palms and strong fingers calloused at their tips from the garden work, the loom, and the needles she used for complicated, beautiful tapestries. "Mine is in my hands. It happens when I make things. My hands." He knew he shouldn't interrupt, but time was short. He cut her off and apologized for it. "Kira, I want you to tell me all about your gift, but later. Right now there are important things to do and decide." "I'm going to show you something," he told her. "Watch this. My gift is in my hands too." He had not planned this, but it seemed necessary. On the table lay the sharp knife with which she had sliced bread for the supper. He picked it up. He leaned down and pulled the left leg of his trousers up. Kira watched, her eyes confused. Quickly, without flinching, he punctured his own knee. Dark red blood trickled in a thin, crooked line down his lower leg. "Oh!" Kira gasped. She stared at him and held her hand to her mouth. "What?" Maddie swallowed, took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and placed both of his hands on his wounded knee. He felt it coming. He felt his veins begin to pulsate. The vibration coursed through him. He felt the power leave his hands and enter his wound. It lasted no more. Then a few seconds and ended. He blinked and took his hand away. They were smeared slightly with blood. The trickled line on his leg had already begun to dry there. "Maddie, whatever are you?" When he gestured, Kira leaned forward and looked carefully at his knee. After a moment, she reached for the woven napkin on the table, dipped it into her tea, and wiped his leg with the damp cloth. The line of blood disappeared. His knee was smooth, unblemished. There was no wound at all. She looked intently at it, and then bit her lip, reached out, and pulled the hem of his trouser leg down over his knee. Oh, excuse me, it's 2 yawns. I see, it was all she said. Matty shook himself free of the wave of fatigue it had caused. It was a very small wound, he explained. I just did it to show you that I could. It didn't take much out of me, but I have done it with bigger things, Kira, with other creatures, with much larger wounds. Humans? Not yet, but I can do it. I can feel it, Kira. With a gift, you know. She nodded. Yes, that's true. She glanced at her own hands resting on the table, still holding the damp cloth. Kira, your leg would take a great deal out of me. I will have to sleep after maybe for a whole day or even longer, and I don't have much time. She looked at him quizzically. Time for what? I will explain. But for now, I think we should start. If I do it right away, I can sleep completely through the night and almost all of the morning. You could use that time to become accustomed to being whole. I am whole, she said defiantly. I meant to having 2 strong legs. You'd be amazed how it feels, how much more easily you could move around, but it will take a little while to adjust to it. She stared at him. She looked down at her twisted leg. Why don't you lie down over there on the couch? I will pull this chair over and sit beside you. Matty began kneading his hands in preparation. He took several deep breaths and felt energized. He could tell his full strength was back. The knee wound had been such a small thing, really. He rose, lifted his wooden chair, and moved it over beside the couch where he had napped that afternoon. He arranged the cushions so she would be comfortable. Behind him, he heard Kira rise from her chair as well, lift her stick from where it leaned against the table and walk across the room. To his surprise, when he turned, he saw she had taken the mugs to the sink and was beginning to wash them as if it were an ordinary evening. Kira! She looked at him. She frowned slightly. She said no. There was no arguing with her, none at all. After a while, Matty gave up the attempt. Finally, he moved his chair again so he could sit in front of the fire. It was chilly in the evenings now, with summer ending. Forrest had been downright cold at night, and he had woken in the mornings during his journey aching and chilled. It was comforting to sit here by the warm fire now. Kira picked up a small wooden frame, with a half-finished piece of embroidery stretched taut across it. She brought it to her chair, moved a basket filled with bright threads to the floor beside her. She leaned her stick against the fireplace wall, sat down, picked up the needle that was waiting, threaded with green attached to the fabric. I will go with you, she said quite suddenly in her soft voice. But I will go as I am, with my leg, with my stick. Matty, puzzled, stared at her. How had she known before he asked it what he was planning to ask of her? I was going to explain, he said after a moment. I was going to persuade you. How? I started to tell you earlier, she said, about my gift, what my hands do. Move your chair closer and I will show you now. He did so. He pulled the crude wooden chair near to where she was. She tilted the embroidery frame so he could see. Like the colorful tapestry on the wall of the blind man's house, this was a landscape. The stitches were tiny and complicated. Each section was a subtle variation in color, so that deep green moved gradually into a slightly lighter shade, and then again lighter, until at the edges it was a pale yellow. The colors combined to make an exquisite pattern of trees, with the tiniest of individual leaves outlined in countless numbers. It's forest, Matty said, recognizing it. Kira nodded. Look beyond it, she said, and extended her finger to point to a section in the upper right, where forest opened, and tiny houses were patterned around curved paths. He thought he could almost make out the house he shared with the blind man, though it was infinitely small in the fabric. Village, he said, examining with awe the meticulousness of her craft. I embroider this scene again and again, Kira said, and sometimes, not always, my hands begin to move in ways I don't understand. The threads take on a power of their own. He leaned closer to look at the embroidery. It was astounding, the detail of it, how tiny it was. Matty, I have never done this with anyone watching, but I can feel it in my hands right now. Watch. He peered intently at her right hand as it picked up the needle threaded with green. She inserted it in the fabric in an unfinished place near the edge of forest. Suddenly both of her hands began to vibrate slightly. They shimmered. He had seen this one day once before. On a day Leader stood at the window, gathered himself, and saw beyond. He looked up at her face and saw that her eyes were closed, but her hands were moving very quickly now. They reached into the basket again and again, changed threads and emotions so fast he could barely follow it. The needle entered the cloth and entered the cloth and entered the cloth. Time seemed to stop. The fire continued to crackle and sputter. Frolic sighed in his sleep at the edge of the hearth. Maddie sat speechless, watching the shimmering hands dart. Hours and days and weeks seemed to go by, yet oddly only a blink, an instant of time passed. Today and tomorrow and yesterday were spun together and held in those hands that moved and moved and moved, yet her eyes were closed. The fire still flickered and the dog still slept. Then it opened. Kira opened her eyes, sat up straighter, and stretched her shoulders. "It tires me," she explained, though he already knew it. "Look now," she said quickly, "because it will fade." He leaned forward and saw that now, in the embroidered scene, at the bottom, two tiny people were entering Forest. He recognized one as himself, backpack on his back. He could even see amazingly the torn place on the sleeve of his jacket. Behind him, meticulously stitched in shades of brown, was Frolic, his tail high, and beside Frolic he saw Kira, her blue dress, her stick wedged under her arm, her dark hair tied back. The top edge of the embroidery had changed as well. Now beside the house, as he had recognized as his, he could see the blind man standing. His posture was that of someone waiting for something. And suddenly Maddie could see, too, crowds of people at the edge of village. They were dragging logs. Someone, it looked like Mentor, was giving directions. They were preparing to build a wall. Maddie sat back. He blinked, astounded, and then leaned forward to look at it again. He realized he wanted to search the scene for a glimpse of Jean, but now the details were gone. He could still see the colored stitches, but it was a simple, exquisitely beautiful but simple landscape again. For a moment he saw the people, flat now, with no detail, but then they faded abruptly and were gone. Kira set the embroidery frame down on the floor and rose from the chair. "We must leave in the morning. I will prepare food." Maddie was still stunned by what he had seen. "I don't understand," he said. "Do you understand what happened when you stabbed your knee with that knife and closed and cured the wound with your hands?" "No," he admitted. "I don't. It's my gift, that's all." "Well," Kira said matter-of-factly, "this is mine. My hands create a picture of the future. Yesterday morning I held that same fabric and saw you come out of Forest. In the afternoon I opened the door, and there you were." She chuckled. "I hadn't seen Frolic, though. It was a nice surprise." The dog awoke and looked up at the sound of his hands. He came to her to be patted. "While you napped," she went on, "I stitched again and saw Father waiting for me. That was just this afternoon. Now you have started to move the logs into place for the wall. And did you notice the change in Forest, Maddie?" He shook his head. "I was looking." "While you napped," she went on, "I stitched again and saw Father waiting for me. That was just this afternoon. Now they have started to move the logs into place for the wall. Did you notice the change in Forest, Maddie?" He shook his head. "I was looking at the people. Forest is thickening. We must hurry, Maddie." Odd, it was the same thing that Leader had seen. "Kira?" Maddie asked. "Yes." She took food from the cupboard. "Did you see a young man with blue eyes, about your age? We call him Leader." She stood for a moment thinking. A strand of dark hair fell across her face, and she brushed it back. She shook her head. "No," she said, "but I felt him." I had to pause the video. I had a phone call there, so I might have missed a few words. For that, I apologize. But I wonder, the fact that she can feel Leader's power, I wonder if she either A, knows he's there, or B, knows that something really bad happened to him. She didn't see him, so hopefully nothing terrible happened to Leader.